There was a time back in the 70s that I didn't have a place to live really, at least not a static home. What I did have was an old pickup truck and an old teardrop camper. I was able to do odd jobs here and there to get some money for gas and food. It wasn't too difficult back then, finding places to park in order to get some sleep. Mostly though, I would just find myself a nice place off the beaten path where I could have some privacy. Mostly when you find a place to spend the night back then, you would be able to sleep throughout the whole night. Occasionally, depending on where you were, a police officer or a park ranger may come along and tell you to move. Rangers rarely did that though, unless they suspected you of doing drugs or some other illegal activity. I somehow doubt that nowadays young people could get away with that as easily as we did back nearly 50 years ago. I don't have a lot of stories really that are too interesting in a scary way from the times I lived out of that camper. There is one single story though that I recall, which when I tell people about today, it sends chills up their spine. It happened while I was traveling through the mountains. There were a lot of off-roads you can take into the woods. Occasionally, when I had a sufficient amount of food, I would take off to one of them, park my truck and camper, and spend as much time there as I could, before it was time to go off and find another job, just to turn around and do it all over again. This was during the colder months, even for being out in the mountains. Despite that, there hadn't really been much snow at all during that time. It was still during the period when leaves and needles were turning brown, and the leaves were beginning to fall. This particular night was about the third night in a row that I had been lodging out in that spot, and the first night of some extremely strong winds. I don't know how many people are familiar with teardrop campers, but I know you've probably seen them before. They're those really tiny trailers you see being pulled around that are shaped like teardrops. There's not really much room inside them, but if you don't really care about space in the first place, then that won't really matter to you. Thing is, they're also very, very light and shake really badly when it's windy outside. The wind was howling through the trees and shaking the camper pretty hard that night. I knew this was going to make it very hard for me to sleep later on, but I wasn't really worried about that. I was just having some beers and listening in on the radio. The gusts of wind would hit the camper, shaking it and sometimes really startling me with how strong the wind was. It was pretty late at night when the wind really began hitting my camper super hard. I thought I heard something smack up against the camper physically. Actually, it kind of sounded like someone had taken their hand and was now pounding it against the wall. The first time it happened, I thought maybe a park ranger had come along and wanted to know what I was doing out there. I got up, opened the door, and checked outside, but there was no one standing outside. I stepped out into the windy night and looked around, checking to see if there was a ranger's truck somewhere outside. There wasn't anything like that around either. I assumed the pounding sound must have either been some debris, or maybe even a part of the camper itself. I gave up and went back inside. It must have been about 20 minutes later when I began to hear a really similar noise. Again, I got up to go and check it out. I didn't think it could be a ranger this time, but maybe there was a part of the camper that was loose or about to come off or something. I wanted to find out before a part got permanently blown away in the wind. I got up and went out with my flashlight. It was really, really dark outside at this time, but fortunately the flashlight I had with me was a good one. I spent about 15 minutes walking around, searching all over the camper. However, I didn't see anything wrong. I went back into it and just hoped that nothing else would happen. Of course, it happened a third time later on. I was beginning to get very frustrated, which wasn't anything like I had felt the previous times. Even upon the third checking though, I didn't find anything at all wrong. I began to wonder if it was something on the inside or something on the underside. I didn't know, but I knew I wouldn't be able to figure it out until the next day when it was light outside. I was able to eventually go to sleep. I had enough beers that despite the weird experiences of that night, it wasn't too difficult for me to drift right off to sleep. By the morning, the wind had calmed down quite a lot actually. It was light enough outside that I thought I would go out and check all over the camper, just to make sure everything was alright. What I saw upon inspecting the trailer is something I would never ever forget. Someone had written something on my door. If you checked in the truck, you would be dead. I immediately looked over at the truck. The driver's side door was ajar. I'd always left it unlocked because I never thought of any reason to lock it. Especially not this far out. I was always inside the camper anyway. I thought about how I never thought to look at the truck at all the night before. Whoever had been slapping the side of the camper must have then quietly snuck themselves back into the cab of the truck and pulled the door closed too without slamming it. I had never considered looking in there. I don't know if it was just a prank or what, but I guess I'm lucky I never had to find out. This is something that just recently happened. I guess it's more strange than really horrifying. I don't know if you'll get scared when hearing it, but I got pretty scared while I was experiencing it. I live in a rural area just outside of a really small town. It's pretty cool, by the way. I get the experience of living in the country while simply being able to walk into town if I need to. I could drive, but if I think the weather is okay, it makes more sense to walk and get the exercise I feel. So the other day I wanted to walk into town and visit the liquor store. That was another reason that I walked, because I thought that if I was going to drink, I should probably walk beforehand as a way to earn what I was doing sort of. It was nice outside anyway, not too cold as it had been recently. The dirt road I lived on went downhill, then connected with a highway. I had to walk along the highway to the main road that led to the shopping area by where we lived. This was all set by the exit of an interstate, so there were a lot of shops in the area. There was only a couple of gas stations alongside the regular highway though. As I got to the bottom of the hill, about to turn onto the highway, I noticed there was someone walking behind me. As he passed me by, since I wasn't walking too quickly, he turned around and looked at me. While this wasn't an unusual thing to do, he kept eye contact with me longer than someone normally would. He almost looked like a character from The Hills Have Eyes, and the look on his face was complete contempt. Needless to say, it was very unnerving. What he did next, though, right after he passed me by, was just really strange. It turns out he was carrying a pencil in his right hand. There was a small abandoned building right before the gas station, and we were both walking through its really small parking lot. He walked up to the sidewalk in front of the small building, leaned down with his pencil in hand, and drew a line that went across the entire length of the sidewalk. He walked on toward the gas station on the left side of the road, while I went across the road, since I had to cross it anyway. I watched him at the gas station, drawing his pencil along the sidewalk in front of it as well. Then afterward, he went inside. I hoped that would be the last time I would have to interact with him. I just kept walking and turned on the road that all the businesses were on. I had a bit of a way to go. When I crossed down a side street, however, I noticed someone walking down it toward me. I was a bit unnerved when I realized it was once again this weird guy with his pencil. I tried my best to walk a little faster. I didn't think he had any reason to care about me at all, but I kept noticing him going up to businesses and doing that pencil thing. I was fortunate the guy kept doing this, because I was just walking in a straight path without making any stops. There was no way he would be able to catch up to me. The closer I got to the store, I stopped noticing him walking behind me. I went inside, got the stuff I had to get, and began on my way back. I was really happy that I didn't see him right away. I was even happier when I kept not seeing him as I walked along the road and turned back onto the highway where I'd first interacted with him. I didn't have any real reason to think he was dangerous per se, but the look he had given me and the really weird behavior was just telling me something was off about him. Mostly though, I had forgotten about it when I reached the original building I had run into the guy at. Now, that building where he'd given me that weird look was right on the corner of a dirt road that led to my house. As I turned the corner, I suddenly jumped in surprise when I noticed the guy was waiting right there, leaning on the side of the building. I'm pretty sure he saw me startled too, and for some reason that really seemed to set him off. "Hey!" he screamed at me as I began walking away from him. "Don't walk away from me! What's your damn problem?" I turned to him for a moment. "I don't have a problem with you. I just didn't expect you to be standing there. You scared me. It's no big deal." "You've been watching me the whole damn day," he said to me. "You've got some damn problem with me. You better tell me before I kick your ass." I'll be honest with you. I was in no way scared of this guy's threat. I had easily 50 pounds on him and was not too sure on experience with getting into fights. That wasn't the point though. Not only was I not looking for any sort of confrontation, I now knew this guy really had something wrong with him. All I wanted to do was get home. I didn't answer him this time. I just kept walking on even faster. It wasn't until I heard some noise on the road that I turned around and noticed he was following me. He wasn't following right on my butt or he wasn't following right close behind me or anything, but it was still very uncomfortable and I just couldn't relax. When I got to my house, I unlocked the door, went inside and locked it again. I then watched out the kitchen window. The man was still there. He watched me from outside before he began walking up my driveway toward my porch. I didn't hesitate. I called the cops immediately. Although I did live in a rural area, it was close enough to the town that it didn't take them too long to get there. The man was caught skulking around the side of my house, trying to run off as the police arrived. I let them know about the threats the man had leveled at me as I had walked by him earlier. I also let them know what he had been doing, walking up to businesses and drawing on their front walks with a pencil. He was taken away by the police. That was a few days ago. I also noticed something after the police had already left. There was a pencil mark all across the length of my entire front porch. I had no idea what the guy is up to, but he definitely had his share of problems. I liked going camping in the area around my rural home when I was a kid and teenager. Although I sometimes had friends come with me when I went, often I would go all by myself. My parents were quite the country folk, and my dad really encouraged it. He had taken me hunting a few times, but honestly, that wasn't really my thing. I did like being out in nature and being away from people though. So for me, camping was the regular thing. I also tended to go and stay out for several days at a time, or as long as I could really. I always tried to go further and further into the woods each time I went out camping. We lived in a really hilly area with a few houses scattered about. It didn't seem like the land was ever used for anything, unless maybe it was hunting by people who owned it. Nevertheless, I would never run into other people while I was out camping. I would try to find new places to experience so I could have a nice time while I was out. When I was 15 years old, I went out camping on a late summer day. School was going to be starting pretty soon, and I wanted as much time as I could get to myself first. I would set up camp each night and try to explore just a little more the following day. I was having a pretty good time. On the third night I was out, however, things changed a lot. I had set up my third camp in an area I had never been in before. I was inside of my tent reading a book by the light of my lantern. Several times I thought I could hear what sounded like someone whistling, coming from the surroundings of my camp. It wasn't windy really that night, and the only other noises were normal bugs and frogs, the same stuff you'd hear when you were in the middle of nowhere. I could have sworn I kept hearing what sounded like someone whistling though. Reasonably, I started getting really paranoid about this. Running into another person during the daytime would have been fine. If I was trespassing, they likely would have told me to just leave. However, running into anyone walking around the woods in the middle of the night was frightening on a whole nother level. After a bit, I heard the whistling come closer and closer. It was clear to me by now that this was definitely a person out there. I turned out the lantern and hoped that whoever this was had not seen the light. The whistling was close enough by that point, though, that it was very unlikely. I remained as still as possible, just hoping beyond hope I would not be noticed. The whistling continued to get closer and closer before it suddenly stopped altogether. It was still quiet outside, and I kept listening in to see if there would be any further noises. For a while, there was nothing, just the sounds of the night around me. I guess I finally began to relax again. I wasn't sure if the whistling was not my imagination, but I guess that whoever was out there either hadn't noticed me, or they didn't really care that I was out there. That's when suddenly something hit up against the side of my tent. I jumped up and noticed a knife had been plunged through the back wall. I caught a glimpse of a man as he sliced the tent open, but it was too dark and quick to make out any features. I reacted on instinct. The entrance to my tent wasn't zipped up, so I was able to bolt out as quickly as possible, leaving all my belongings behind. I ran and ran and ran, having no idea if anyone was chasing after me or not. I kept running until I was completely winded. I had a small keychain flashlight that I was able to look around with. It didn't seem like I had been followed, which was only a small relief. I was still terrified. I didn't dare go back to the tent. Instead, I did my best to find my way home in the dark with nothing but that small flashlight. It took me quite a while to do so, but eventually I finally made it. My dad came with me the next day to look for my things. We found the tent. Nothing had been taken, but the tent was completely cut open on one side. My dad figured it was someone who was just trying to scare me, since they didn't take anything, nor did they chase after me. Regardless though, it was still scary, and it did keep me from camping, for a little while at least. I love metal concerts. The atmosphere, the flashing lights, the pounding of the beat up your spine, there's really nothing like it. That very same atmosphere, though, can be a breeding ground for a lot of dangerous activity. I learned that the hard way at my last concert. I went with a friend to see In This Moment, Avatar, New Year's Day, and my personal favorite, Ice Nine Kills, as part of their Terror Tour. It sounds ominous already, but trust me, that concert was amazing. They played all our favorites, and like the teenage metalheads we were, we screamed along with all our lungs put into it. New Year's Day went first as an opener, and the flashing lights caused spots in my eyes. Avatar went next, and the first half of their set went flawlessly. They played up the ominous angle of being with the devil between songs, and I got chills as the voice reverberated up my spine. They started up one of my favorite songs from their new album. I remember the gleam in my friend's eyes as she grabbed my arm and shook me in sheer excitement. The music and vocals built and built. The crowd was going absolutely feral down on the floor. I think I even saw someone in the pit get ousted up into the air and crowd surf. The chorus was just about to start when the lead vocalist froze in his tracks, let out a strangled "oh" into the mic. The other members stopped playing a second later. The only sound was the quickly fading reverb from the amps on stage. The crowd seemed to hold its breath. Little puffs of smoke from the crowd of bodies on the floor were visible. I could swear they represented someone whose soul had just been scared out of them. People around us started murmuring, everyone wondering what was going on, while the singer was trying to compose things. No one would tell us anything. All of a sudden, he shouted into the mic, "Security! Can we get security here? Now!" The lights in the arena flicked on one by one, flooding the space with stark white light. After over an hour in the dark, it was almost blinding. After a second of blinking away spots, we could see that near the front of the stage, a small circle had formed in the crowd, giving a wide berth to someone in the middle. That someone was crumpled into a heap on the floor, and they'd started screaming. Security pushed their way through the remaining concert-goers and immediately ran to the guy with first aid in tow. They looked like they were struggling to turn him over, and the guy curled around himself as if in pain. I couldn't see very well from where I was sitting, but it seemed like his hands were clasped firmly against his stomach. When one of the security guys finally got him onto his back, the guy's hands accidentally fell to the side. And that's when what can only be described as a baseball-sized bubble of blood exploded across his shirt. Apparently, he'd scooped up the blood in his hands and was praying it didn't fall out. Security immediately realized their mistake and pressed firmly against the wound. People in the crowd began to call 911, and 20 minutes later, EMS and police showed up, with the full flashing lights and stretchers and everything. We were all told to stay calm, and were quickly directed outside to the parking lot. My friend and I clung to each other through the surge, so we wouldn't get separated. I remember that we didn't speak for a long time, even on the drive back. We saw some news that was written about the incident about a month later. Apparently, someone thought that when the guy shoved up against them in the mosh pit, he was hitting on their girlfriend or something. That's when they pulled out a knife and began stabbing him in the stomach. They pled guilty, with the defense that they were extremely high at the time, but that didn't lessen the severity of their sentence. As to how this person managed to sneak a knife past security personnel, we have no idea. It just goes to show you that even though a rough and tumble concert can be fun, it can also lead to reckless or even dangerous situations when emotions are running that high. The Taste of Waterville, Maine is an annual food festival that showcases food from every corner of the town and basically gives locals and outsiders alike a taste of everything it has to offer. It has everything you could think of: small independent Thai places, chain chicken wing restaurants, family-owned pancake restaurants, and even a place where breweries could sample their products. That last part is pretty significant, because last time I went, I had recently turned 21 and was legally able to buy drinks from the stands if I wanted to. I did take advantage of that. The 21 plus section was located a little removed from the rest of the festival, surrounded by ropes so those without a blue wristband couldn't get in so easily. It was right next to a big field where a band played for the festival guests. This is relevant because I'm pretty sure I got a new sample drink every time a new song started. I don't really remember much clearly after that, so all that I'm about to say is scattered memories with a sober brain to fill in the pieces. I remember standing by a strawberry beer stand in the corner for a company whose name escapes me when a random girl walked up to me and started chatting. She said her name was Amanda, and I'm not gonna lie, she was pretty cute. She had long blonde locks in a braid, was athletic looking, and wearing glasses as well. Exactly my type, really. She was extremely physical right away, touching my arms and all that, and complimenting me quite a bit. I'd never really received that sort of attention from a girl before, so I've got to be honest, I was really into the vibe we were building. I wanted to get to know her. So I drunkenly offered to buy us some food, and she agreed. Together, we waited in line for some chicken wings. I was weirdly happy to find out we both liked them on the spicier side, and grabbed a table. I sat across from her. just chatting about anything we could think of really, messily eating wings and having an amazing time. I remember the top of her head had a pink tinge from the sunset behind her, which made her look even more beautiful to me. Through the haze of beer, I was determined to get her number, so I asked her outright. She seemed kind of surprised but happy at the same time, and took out a Sharpie of all things from her bag, wrote her number right across my arm. It was just like in all those movies I'd seen. Then she smiled at me. Her eyes sparkled with mischief, as she suggested going back behind the trees for some privacy, if you know what I mean. Who was I to say no, especially with my inhibitions removed? She grabbed my arm and practically dragged me through the crowd. A little ways off from the festival was this old footbridge that spread across to an adjacent river. It was lined on the other side by an old abandoned toll shack and a stretch of trees, the perfect place for the amount of privacy we needed. I remember my shoes clacking hard on the wood as Amanda led the way. My gaze was drawn to the river. The water was rushing hard, and it turned a deep blue-black with the already set sun. I remember vaguely thinking the bridge might snap and send us tumbling down 40 feet. I quickly got over it as we reached the shack, though. Amanda pulled me inside with a strength she didn't look like she had. I was on cloud 9, anticipating the first kiss and everything that happens after. That's when Amanda's entire personality changed, and things went to hell. She scowled and pressed me against the wall, hands on my chest. I leaned toward her to ask what was wrong, when someone ran up behind her and punched me square in the face and pushed me down to the ground. I could only see that the person was big and a guy. He kept wailing on me. My eyes swam, and the last thing I remember is looking up at Amanda, who then started laughing. I woke up a few hours later with one hell of a headache and a hangover. I felt exhausted, disoriented. I couldn't remember where I was or why I was here. When I tasted blood on my lip, it all came flooding back. The festival, the fountain of beer, Amanda. My wallet and phone were missing, so I couldn't call anyone for help, or even what time it was. My only option was to stagger out of the shack and stumble across the bridge, face coated in what felt like a thick layer of dried blood. It felt like my nose was out of shape as well. Maybe broken, maybe not. Eventually, a lady on the road asked me if I was okay, and if there was someone she could call for me. I said yes, and she even offered to drive me to the hospital. My nose was definitely broken. Aside from the corrective surgery, there wasn't much they could do. I'm still breathing okay, by the way. As for Amanda and her partner in crime, they were never found. I don't know if that was even her real name. They did try the number she wrote across my arm, but that turned out to be a fake too. Lesson learned. Don't let random cute girls drag you across a bridge without being sober, I guess. Or at all, really. Against all our better judgment, my roommate got us an apartment on Craigslist. We were scrambling to find a place before we graduated college, desperate for our independence, and for her to avoid flying across the country back home. The rent was cheaper than any other place we'd looked at. We'd have to heat it ourselves and pay for internet, but hey, beggars can't be choosers, right? It turned out to be a trailer for rent on the landlord's personal property. It was pretty nice, all things considered. Carpeted floor, a spacious and open kitchen with a bar setup, and 2 large bedrooms. It was all open in a pretty blue color too, which added to the value of the place for us. There was even a garden set up out front, with some flowers already in bloom. My roommate had communicated with the landlord a couple of times. Well, I'd only ever seen him once by the time he gave us the keys, so while we didn't know him that well, he seemed like a perfectly average guy, middle-aged with a wife and young grandkids, well-meaning as well. He was skeptical of us being so young, since most of his tenants up till this point had been older retirees, But once he saw that we never threw huge parties or missed a rent payment or had our music turned up too loud, he started to quickly relax. That's when things got weird though. It was in small ways at first, things you wouldn't really notice, or you might even find thoughtful. He drove by often to make sure everything was working okay. He'd offer us rides into town for work, and once even wanted to pay for our groceries for no reason at all. We thought we'd hit the landlord jackpot, and were ready to live the rest of our 2-year lease worry-free. Things quickly escalated when he asked my roommate out to dinner. The request seemed innocent enough, but when I looked at her face after she told me, her expression said she was a little uncomfortable. I asked if he meant both of us, as a get-to-know-you sort of thing, or if he did that with all his tenants to build a better relationship. After some serious thinking, though, we decided he had not-so-good intentions, and just let his offer hang in the air. Maybe he'd get the hint that she wasn't interested, without any of the complicated stuff that might come with directly turning him down. My roommate didn't bring it up again, and life went by as normal for a couple of weeks. He still seemed friendly and still offered us rides to work if we needed it, but every once in a while we noticed he would look a little angry. Then a smile would slip on his face, and he would return to his usual self, almost as if it was a mask he put on. He must have sensed we were quickly cooling off about him, so he pressed to go out to dinner with my roommate again. This time he made it clear that I would not be invited along. This time it was also over text. So my roommate at least had something in writing she could turn to if things escalated further. And escalated was much too small a word to describe what happened next. He started to drive by our place in his white truck every single day. Sometimes he wouldn't even say anything, just sit out front with the engine running. I always felt a cold chill run down my spine whenever he turned up, and I can't even imagine how my roommate must have felt every time we heard his truck rev outside. It got to the point where we put our shades up in the living room almost 24/7. It was a real shame, because we both loved the sunlight that came through the space. It led to our new home feeling oppressive, dark, and gloomy. More than once, my roommate said she felt as if the walls were closing in on her. In a sense, they were. She rarely went outside unless she had to, just in case the landlord was skulking outside. Even then, she asked me more often than not to go shopping for the both of us. The one silver lining in all of this is that between the two of us, we were able to compile quite a bit of evidence. The text conversations, detailed notations of when he would do his little drive-bys, his attitude whenever he saw us, the pressure to get my roommate all alone. The problem was finding a place to live if he kicked us out for going to someone with this. Rent in our area is not cheap, and it took us forever to find the trailer in the first place, so we either had to move fast with a big chunk of money or cut our losses. The other part we were concerned about was the landlord doing something even more drastic if he felt insulted, following us, breaking in, or worse. Either way, something had to be done. We arranged a ride with a friend to take us to the local police station and booked it off the property so the landlord wouldn't catch us leaving. Unfortunately, since the guy hadn't technically broken the law or done anything illegal, they couldn't do much more than contacting him via letter and advising him to leave us alone. It was nothing binding like a restraining order, but it was something on the record at least. Needless to say, we moved out not long after. I live in a small apartment that rents from a well-established renting company now, and I've never taken up offers from Craigslist again. As far as I know, neither has my roommate, but I can't exactly say for sure. Growing up, the way I would describe my grandmother's house was brown. Popcorn cream ceilings bled into tan walls that spilled into a brown linoleum floor in her kitchen. The living room walls were a deep chestnut brown that seemed to absorb all light coming in through the shuttered window, if any seemed to get in at all. Even the carpet covering the rest of the house was brown, chocolate to be exact, or perhaps the color of mud depending on how you looked at it. All in all, the house had a dark, dreamy effect to it that I really couldn't explain until much, much later in my life, and by that time the explanation horrified me. This isn't one of those stories where your relative turns out to be a murderer or goes crazy and tries to kill you. This is a different, more subtle kind of horror, the kind that anyone can face anywhere at any time without even knowing, especially if you're a child or someone who doesn't recognize the danger. And it all started with the carpet. From early elementary to 6th grade, I would go to Grandma's after school most days, so someone could watch me while my mom went to work. She worked nights in the next town over, which my grandma also happened to live in, so it worked out. Everything was fine for a countless amount of days. Me, my grandma, and my parents had a routine going. My mom would drop me off, I would watch TV and eat dinner with Grandma. Then my dad would come get me a few hours later, when he got off work for the day. It wasn't a perfect routine looking back, but it worked well for our family. I would lay on that carpet for hours, brushing my hands over the soft fibers, and even pressing my face down into it to use it as a pillow. It always gave off a unique smell I couldn't quite place. Damp, kind of musty. It was almost overpowering at times, enough to routinely make me sick. Though I didn't know that was what was happening at the time. I would just get a runny nose and a pretty bad cough every few weeks. My parents chalked it up to a bug going around at school, but it was much more than that. Around that same time, my grandma's health began to rapidly decline as well. She developed a cough that lasted for months, and she started to have tiny gaps in her memory. Small things at first, like where she'd misplaced her keys. She also seemed more frail than before, as if she didn't have the energy to move around much at all. I realized that part might have come from just aging, but something didn't seem right about it. When I was 12, my parents finally decided I was old enough to stay home for a couple hours after school, which gratefully lightened their workload for the day and their gas money. Strangely enough, within only a single month, my symptoms entirely disappeared. The smell still lingered in my memory, but I was all in all a healthy kid once again. The same couldn't be said for my grandma, though. Her physical and mental health rapidly declined. Eventually, she had to be moved to a nursing home when I was 16, and that's when the terrible truth was discovered. Her entire house had been infected with black mold, inside the walls, down through the cellar, and most notably directly under the thin brown carpet that coated the living room, the same carpet I pressed my face against day after day for years, indirectly inhaling hundreds of mold spores. Now, that may not seem like the scariest thing in the world. After all, molding food in your fridge just gets thrown away and forgotten in 5 minutes. But let me tell you about the effects of exposure to black mold, especially when it's long-term. Body aches, pains, wheezing, cough, shortness of breath, memory issues, and weight loss, all leading to the most dangerous outcome of all, mycotoxicosis, or mold poisoning. Now it all made sense. My constant illness, Grandma's frailty and memory issues, everything. With how much mold they found in the house, we were being poisoned the entire time. My parents immediately rushed to get me checked out, but fortunately, no long-term damage had taken place, and I was able to fully recover. My grandma was a different story, though. Living day in and day out in that mold-infested house had accelerated her developing Alzheimer's, and she never fully recovered.